So this is part 2 of a lecture on viral diseases given on April 1st, 2020. And the main goal of this lecture is to just talk a little bit about why many viral diseases like polio and measles are no longer common in today's world, specifically in the United States. And so there are over 400 different viruses that can infect humans and cause disease. And you can see a list of some of those diseases here. They're all caused by different viruses. So you can see hepatitis, measles, smallpox, flu listed here. But several of the diseases on this list, such as smallpox, polio, cholera, are no longer particularly common. You've probably never met anybody who has had them, specifically in the United States. And the reason for that is vaccines. And so vaccines, in short, are biological preparations that produce an immunity to a specific disease without prior exposure to that disease. And vaccines are sort of a medical miracle. And the way that they work is by triggering a mild primary immune response, usually where the host will have no symptoms that would normally be associated with the disease. And the mechanism by which this works is your immune system, or the host's immune system, can make memory T and memory B cells in response to vaccination and create a memory of a disease without actually having to have it or suffer through it. And so vaccines are normally administered via injection, so shots, but there's been some success with edible vaccines, specifically for polio and typhoid fever, where recombinant DNA has been introduced into plant cells to basically make GMO plants that can be eaten and vaccinate people in that way. And this is particularly important for places where access to medical care is limited, as well as for countries that have relatively low income, so third world countries. This would be an effective way to administer a lot of vaccines to a lot of people over a short period of time and in kind of a low-cost manner. And so there are a lot of different types of vaccines in today's world. Originally, one of the ways people vaccinated themselves against smallpox was by rubbing open sores or pustules on each other. Thankfully, we no longer have to do that. We can make vaccines. And so one of the preparations for vaccines is what's known as an attenuated preparation, or an attenuated vaccine, where you're still injecting a virus that is technically alive but is weakened. So it's either a strain with very low virulence or low pathogenicity. And that attenuated virus can trigger an immune response, but is too weak to actually infect the host and cause symptoms. And some vaccines that are made in this manner are the MMR vaccine, as well as the vaccines for yellow fever and typhoid. There's also ways to create what's called an inactivated vaccine, where you take a previously very virulent virus and you basically just destroy its ability to infect the host, but leave it physically intact. And you can do that with chemicals, heat, or radiation. And so the virus is still intact, but it no longer has the ability to infect a host. It's effectively just been inactivated. But it can still be recognized by our immune system, and the immune system can still mount the proper response and create antibodies to it. And two other types of vaccines are what's known as toxoid vaccines, which contain inactivated compounds that would normally cause illness. Toxoid vaccines are actually vaccines against bacterial diseases. So the tetanus toxin and diphtheria toxin are two very harmful exotoxins produced by these bacteria. Toxoid vaccines contain inactivated versions of these to sort of prime the immune system to know how to deal with these exotoxins if they do come into contact with them at a later time. And then the last type of vaccine is a subunit vaccine, which is basically where a virus is taken and broken down into small pieces. They are large enough to still cause an immune response, but because the virus is in pieces and no longer intact, it once again can't infect the host. And so you can mount that immune response, which you're not infected. And some types of vaccines that are subunit vaccines are the one for hepatitis B, as well as the vaccine against human papillomavirus, or HPV, and the flu vaccine. And so there's sort of this old wives' tale about the people getting sick immediately after getting the flu vaccine, and they think they have the flu and that the vaccine causes it. It's actually not possible, because as a subunit vaccine, the flu vaccine can cause an immune response, but it doesn't have the ability to actually infect you and cause any symptoms. And so just to reiterate how much of a miracle these vaccines are to prevent certain diseases, I wanted to give you an idea of what polio used to look like in the United States. And so you probably don't know anyone who has polio or who has had it, but this is a picture from the not too distant past, probably in the 1940s, of what a polio ward used to look like. And so the polio virus affects the nervous system and basically leads to paralysis and muscle wasting as a result of that. And so the paralysis in your neurons can lead to shrinkage of muscles that you would normally use that can no longer function. And so in this polio ward here on the left, you can actually see that each one of these chambers is holding a small child. And what these chambers are called are iron lungs, because the paralysis associated with polio can also affect the muscle called the diaphragm that moves up and down and allows you to breathe. And so in order to combat that and allow these children to continue to live, they were put into these iron lung machines, which could help them, which would basically breathe for them. The downside of this is that each one of these patients would have to remain in this iron lung for the entirety of their life, because that diaphragm muscle remained paralyzed. I think there was someone who was in one of these for about 60 years. Some less severe cases just required a lot of braces and crutches. This is another child from the 1940s. But what's important to note is that polio is still present today. It's been eradicated in the United States, but there are countries in the Middle East and Africa where polio is still a thing. And there are some countries where measles is also still a thing. So measles used to be relatively eradicated from the United States as well, but has been resurging because of the anti-vaccine movement, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. But measles is a pretty serious disease. Sometimes we just kind of equate it to chickenpox, but it's actually much more virulent than chickenpox, causes a lot more damage to the host, and can lead to some pretty serious long-term complications, including blindness, as well as death. So it's not just kind of like a scratchy rash. It's a lot more serious than that. And the reason that we don't tend to put a lot of time thinking about polio is because the vaccines that are designed to prevent it do it really well. And so the polio vaccine was introduced in 1955, and about 5 years later, 97% of the cases of polio in the United States were completely gone. And another 20 years after that, polio was eradicated completely from the United States. Extremely effective. And the same is true for the MMR vaccine, which prevents measles. You can see that in the 1940s to about 1960, there were upwards of 500,000 cases of measles per year. At some points, almost up to 750,000 cases in a single year. The MMR vaccine was introduced in the early 60s, which is about right here. And you can see that there's a dramatic spike, a dramatic drop in the amount of cases in the United States, almost to zero, which is pretty amazing. And the way that vaccines really exert these amazing effects is through what's called herd immunity. And herd immunity is this idea that when enough of a specific population or enough people are immune to a disease, either by being vaccinated for it or by having it and then becoming immune, it's harder for that disease to spread from person to person. And so the herd immunity idea is illustrated in this graphic on the right. And you can see that in a non-immunized or not immune population of all these blue people, when there's a couple sick individuals, the disease can spread really quickly because no one is immune. Whereas on the bottom of the graphic, when people are immune in yellow, even when there's a few sick individuals introduced into that population, the disease has a really difficult time spreading. And what herd immunity does is not just protect all of the individuals who are immune, either because they've been vaccinated or because they have had a prior illness. It also protects people who cannot be vaccinated or who are not immune, such as small children and people with compromised immune systems. And so by having this herd immunity, we protect our vulnerable populations from infection by sick individuals. The thing about herd immunity is that it has a particular threshold by which it works. And so if you look here at this top graphic, you can see that when no one is vaccinated or when there's nobody who is immune in the population, disease can spread super quickly. And the more people who become vaccinated or who become immune, the slower that disease spreads and the slower that individuals become infected. But there's still a pretty reasonable amount of infected people when 75% of people are vaccinated. Sounds like a pretty high number, but it's actually low enough that disease can still spread to those vulnerable populations. And so the threshold for most diseases is somewhere around 90% of people being vaccinated or immune. Because at 90% and above, those vulnerable populations are protected because the disease spread is so slow. And so to put that into words, I guess, the herd immunity threshold is just the number of people who need to be vaccinated for herd immunity to do its job and for it to actually work. And for most diseases, including measles, the herd immunity threshold is about 90%. This varies based on the different diseases. Sometimes it has to be up to 95% of people who are vaccinated or immune in order for herd immunity to hold. And this is why anti-vaccination is sort of a problem and why measles is resurging in the United States. And so over the past couple of years, we've seen a drop in vaccination rates, and it's now in some states fallen below that herd immunity threshold, particularly for measles. And so in addition to that drop in vaccination rates, we've seen a resurgence in the number of measles cases, because if, as we just saw in that graphic, the vaccination rate or the number of people immune drops below the threshold, it becomes really easy for this disease to spread and infect all of those vulnerable populations. And so as of 2019, about this time last year, there are already almost 1,000 cases of measles as compared to 63 10 years ago, and that's only for half of the year. The number continues to grow, and is what makes the anti-vaccination movement very dangerous, because when you don't vaccinate, we threaten the herd immunity of the entire population, and we can really cause damage to our more vulnerable citizens, especially young children and people who are immunocompromised.